I planted this rose hedge 25 years ago, and it sure seems to like where I put it.
It certainly does. You know, a lot of people think that growing roses is a very tricky business, but it doesn't have to be, as long as you pick the right roses for the part of the country where you live. I'm Barbara Damrosch.
And I'm Elliot Coleman, and if you'll stay with us for the next half hour, we'll show you how to grow roses without pain.
On Gardening Naturally. Gee, Elliot, these roses that I planted last spring really came through the winter well.
I'll say they did. Look at that new, healthy foliage. And we had a vicious winter last year. It got to, what, 13 below here in the yard.
Yeah.
And you didn't put any winter protection in there at all.
No, I didn't do anything to them. And you know, last summer, the foliage was really clean. There were no bugs, there were no diseases.
Is that because you planted them where good compost?
Oh, I think our good compost might have had something to do with it, but it was also the type of roses that I chose. These are the old-fashioned, vigorous shrub-type roses. They're not the modern hybrid teas where you sort of have to sit there and hold their hands all summer, especially in a climate like ours.
And where'd you get these?
Well, I mail-ordered them. I bought them by mail from a nursery right here in Maine in North Yarmouth. And, I was happy with what I got. I just sort of went by the catalog descriptions and the advice of a few friends, and I liked what I got. But you know what I'd like to do? I'd like to go down there and take a look at all of them.
Oh, I think you should do that. I bet you'll get some great new ideas.
I'm sure I would. Well, I certainly found what I was looking for. I'm at Royal River Roses, and the neat thing about this nursery is that the display gardens are filled with mature plantings of old roses and some new ones as well. And the nice thing is that I know these are vigorous, hardy roses because they've been here a long time. And also, I can see them in their mature state and see what they're going to look like in 10, 15 years in my garden. They were planted a long time ago by Suzanne Verrier, who founded this nursery. And in here, you'll find a world of romance, fragrance, and beauty. Come, I'll show you. Roses are very ancient plants. They've been found growing wild in every continent of the globe. And some people find those old wild or species roses the most charming of all. They tend to have a very relaxed way of growing and very simple flowers, often with few petals. Here's one that's often considered a species rose, Rosa hugonis, or Father Hugo's rose. It also came to be known as the yellow rose of Texas, though oddly enough, it first came to notice in the U.S. in 1830, growing on a farm in Manhattan. It's a little past its bloom right now, and it would also bloom more heavily if planted in full sun, but it's quite nice. Come on, I'll show you another great American rose. This is Rosa virginiana. Now, you might think from the name that it just comes from Virginia, but in fact, it grows wild all over almost the entire eastern half of the U.S., scrambling over roadsides and in fields and all over the place. Very large but simple flower, just 5 pink petals on a nice big healthy shrub. Now, like most old roses, this only blooms once in June and then it's finished. But the foliage has a nice fall color, and the round hips that follow turn a nice red color in the fall as well. Here's another species rose with nice foliage, Rosa spinosissima, the Scotch briar. Even though its white flowers have faded now, the lacy blue foliage is lovely, and those round hips will also be beautiful in fall. I'm standing in a part of the garden that you really wouldn't expect to be a good place for roses. It's quite shaded, really. The filtered light from these tall willows makes a dappled shade down here, but these old-fashioned roses are doing beautifully. Now, these are mostly old French roses, or gallicas. Early part of the 19th century, these were hybridized from old species roses. And they're not quite what you would expect a rose to look like. When you picture a rose, you probably imagine something like this hybrid tea. It has a large flower with a high center. But this old rose has a completely different shape. It's smaller and has a flat appearance and a bunched up petal arrangement called quartering. This is a typical old rose shape. It's really quite lovely. This is one called Gloire de France, the glory of France, pale pink with a dark pink center. Now this one over here is also a pale pink. This is a class of rose called the damask roses. This one is very fragrant, something that you often don't find in the modern roses that have been bred more for their shape than their fragrance. This is a Middle Eastern rose called Ispahan, also from the early part of the 19th century. Here's a really sweet little rose called Petite Lisette, and that's another of the Gallicas, the ancient French roses. Again, the early part of the 19th century. Look at the button eye in the center of this little rose and the perfect arrangement of petals. Now, not old European roses are pale pink. There are many, many different colors. You don't get the yellows and the peachy tones the way you did with that hybrid tea I just showed you, but you get pure whites and all the gradations of pink, including some wonderful clear pinks, dark pinks, or this cherry red rose. I particularly love the dusty purple color of this one, which is Cardinal de Richelieu. And there's another purple one over here, very warm, velvety purple. Nobody knows what this rose is, which very often happens with old roses. One of the most fun things about getting involved with them is being a detective and finding old roses in cemeteries or foundation holes and trying to figure out what they are. There are many rose groups, like the Heritage Roses group, that will help you sort all of this out. Gardening Naturally will return on TLC. Here's an interesting group of roses called the moss roses. This one is Madame Louis Levesque, and as you can see, it has a sort of a furry, mossy appearance on the stems and also on the sepals. Not the most fragrant rose I've ever smelled, but this one over here smells very sweet and has an unusual coloring. Notice the lavender pink stripes on this French rose, which is called Camieux. During the 20th century, the rose hybridizers have been doing some wonderful work combining the strength and the vigor of the old roses with some of the modern traits like continuous bloom. They've been especially productive with Rosa rugosa, a Japanese species rose which tends to bloom all summer anyway. This is a hybrid rugosa called Hansa, and it's a very vigorous, dense shrub. The foliage is a typical rugosa. Rugosa means wrinkled, and it has bright green wrinkled foliage. But the best thing about it is these huge clear pink flowers that have a spicy fragrance, very cinnamony. Now these grow wild along the New England coast, but those are the original Japanese species escaped in New England. Now here's another hybrid rugosa called Henry Hudson. This has white flowers, and the leaves are wrinkled, but you notice they have a darker, bluer color to them. Here's another hybrid rugosa that's quite different from the others. This is Sarah Van Fleet, which is a lovely pink lavender color. And it has the vigor and the very good repeat bloom of the rugosas, but the other parts of its parentage contributed this foliage, which is broad, flat, not wrinkly at all. Here's another fine group of very hardy 20th century roses that comes out of Canada. They're called the Explorer roses because they're all named after famous explorers. This one is William Baffin, and if you need a super-duper hardy climber for a cold climate, it won't die in the winter, get William Baffin. What's interesting about climbing roses, they really aren't vines. They don't twine, they don't cling. They're just very lanky shrubs that send out big canes with thorns that hook over the plants next to them in the forest. And then when they get above the leaf canopy, they send out horizontals, and that's where the bloom is. So if you're growing a climbing rose, you want to provide it with an arbor or something like this one to climb up. Anchor it with something like this foam-covered wire that won't hurt the canes, and then train it horizontally so that it sends up these little lateral shoots. Pinch off the dead tips, and it'll keep producing blossoms up here. Here's another Canadian explorer rose that I'm completely in love with. It's called John Davis, and what I love is the camellia-like shape of this blossom and that hint of salmon in the center. This is also a very vigorous rose. It can get as tall as 6 feet, and you could train this one as a climber. The one that I'm going to take home with me today is only about 4 feet tall, and here it comes.
One rose to go, Barbara.
This is called a cinnabone, and it has a very bright, almost red pink flower to it. And this is David King. David and his wife, Eileen, are the current owners of Royal River Roses. David, I have loved touring your garden today.
Well, I've loved having you here. Pleasure to have you along.
Thank you very much. There's a real art to finding the flowers that look best alongside old roses. I like to see perennials chosen that bloom at the same time as the roses in soft, complementary colors. For instance, the lavender of this catmint is wonderful with these roses, or the soft yellow of this potentilla, or the white foliage of these artemisias, or the stronger accent of these maiden pinks. And you could be even a little more daring, like with that rust-colored yarrow over there, along with the pink roses next to it. Another great combination might be a mixture of pansies in different soft pastel shades with some forget-me-nots lining the edge of a garden, or foxgloves. They bloom at the same time in lovely pastel shades, but there's a contrast in the shape of the flower, that tall spike as opposed to the round roses. And how about some columbines, say in a deep purple-blue color? But of course, the possibilities are endless. When I plant roses, I like to plant them when they're dormant, that is, before they've started to really grow, and bare root, that is, with no soil around the roots. You can also buy roses potted up. Often in garden centers, you'll see them in cardboard boxes. Well, you can actually plant that, cardboard and all. Just trim off the little lip around the top. If the rose is in a plastic pot, obviously you want to ease the plant out of the plastic and put it in as gently as possible without disturbing the soil around the roots. When I get my bare root plant, I like to soak it a little bit before I plant it. Hopefully I've planted as soon as I've gotten it. If it has to wait a few days, I'll usually try to heel it into the soil to keep the roots healthy. Now, I have to think very carefully about where I'm going to put a rose, because roses need sun and they need good drainage. If you're not quite sure whether you've got good drainage or not, best idea is to dig a deep hole big enough for the roots and then fill it with water and see how long it takes for the water to disappear. If it's taking an hour or more, it's probably not a good spot. Roses appreciate moisture in order to bloom, but they don't like to have their roots sitting in water. If you don't have good drainage and you really want to have it in that spot, you might try building up a raised bed and see if your roses work there. Now, to dig a really good hole for a rose, you have to be almost more industrious than you think you might have to be. This is a very little rose. It's a dwarf that's only going to grow to about 2 feet high. But I've given it quite a nice hole here. I want to make sure that the roots will fan out without being at all constrained. Roots on roses are long and stringy, and they're not the kind of roots that like being cut back. You only would prune them back if they were damaged in some way. Another thing I think about when I'm determining the size of my hole is where the bud union is going to come in relation to the soil surface. The bud union is where the rose has been grafted onto a rootstock. Now, very often I'll grow roses on their own roots that have not been grafted, but sometimes they have been. You can see where the strong rootstock was snipped off and the rose that was grafted onto it is growing. It's a very fertile part of the plant because this is where all the canes come. If I lived in a warm climate, I'd probably plant this above the soil surface so that it could be warmed by the sun and get the rose off to a good start. But in Zone 5, where I am, this is rather fragile, and I have to protect it from the cold in the spring or in the winter. So I'll bury this bud union a couple of inches below the soil surface. In an in-between zone, 6 or 7, you might have it just about at soil level. Now, this soil is pretty good. There's a lot of established perennials growing in this bed, and they're doing fine. But I'm going to put some rock phosphate into the soil before I put it back into the hole, and also some of our homemade compost, just to give this rose an extra good start in life. Add a little more of that in there. Work it in. Roses like a slightly acid pH, but they have a lot of leeway, and I have been liming this bed, so I'm not going to worry about that right now. What I'm going to do is make a little mound in the bottom of the hole, like that. Then I'm going to take my plant, put it over the mound, so that the roots are fanning out in each direction. And make sure that I can do that in a way that I'm not cramping the roots and the bud union is below the soil surface. I'm also going to take off this tag because in time it could girdle the plant and injure it. I'll make a note somewhere, draw myself a little map of what rows I planted here. Okay, now I'm gently going to replace the soil around the roots. I'm firming it with my hand. Some people put their feet down in there and tromp it down, but I think that's a little rough treatment for a rose. So I do it with my hands instead, and I make sure that I get all the air pockets out because those can cause the roots to dry out. And when I get it to a point where the roots are covered, I'm going to give it some water. Let it run for a while. This will help the air pockets to fill. All of this soil will filter down into any pockets that are there. Now, after that water is all soaked in, we can fill up the rest of the hole. There, this should almost do it. Okay, bud union safely covered. I might even mound that bud union slightly if it's very early spring, and then very, very gently later on pull the soil away, but not harming the tender shoots that are coming up. Okay, the last thing I would do is just make a slight saucer, the way you would when you're planting any tree or shrub, to make watering easier. There, that will hold the water as I water my newly planted rose bush. Good luck, Rose.
Companion planting is the theory that certain types of plants growing next to each other can be of mutual benefit. The idea is controversial, though. Some people are sure it works, others aren't so sure. Well, I'm always reluctant to throw away something that seems so much like old peasant wisdom, so I'd like to look into it further. And I have found that there is evidence that when deep-rooted plants grow next to shallow-rooted plants, the deep-rooted plants have the ability to bring moisture up from lower soil levels during the night and make it available to the shallow-rooted plants. Obviously, a benefit. Is there anything to the more complicated things? For example, the one that says that garlic should be planted next to roses? Well, there are gardeners who feel that there is an odor from the foliage or possibly something from their roots that helps keep pests off plants nearby. Or maybe there is just some other thing going on. Whatever, as far as I'm concerned, anything that gets me to come out into the garden and pay attention to what's going on is a benefit. And if it just benefits my attention, even if it doesn't benefit the roses or the garlic, I'm all for it. So I'm going to plant some garlic around my roses.
My rugged old roses don't need a lot of maintenance. Sometimes I'll douse them with a seaweed-based fertilizer. They seem to like that. Or I'll water them if it's very dry. Roses are deep-rooted, drought-resistant shrubs, but they won't bloom as well if they don't get watered in hot weather. I'll also do a little bit of pruning from time to time. In early spring, I'll come and see if there's any winter dieback and cut off any dead wood. But I like to wait until there's a flush of foliage so that I can tell what's dead and what's not. With something like this hybrid rugosa, Belle Poitevine, this is going to get to a nice big mound. But if it starts to get leggy in April, I'll head it back to produce bushier growth. Now this eglantine over here needs a little bit more drastic treatment sometimes. Eglantine is a rose that Shakespeare wrote about. And what I love about it is that the foliage smells like apples, especially after a rain. But it's kind of lanky, and it needs to get dead wood pruned out. Now you can see that down here, where this stem was cut off, 4 new shoots are coming along. And here, there was some renewal pruning done. An old cane was taken out, and as a result, there's some new shoots coming out from the bud union and putting out new growth. So there'll be more bloom lower on the shrub. Now over here, there's a rose that needs an entirely different treatment. I can't prune it in April at all. The old ancient hybrids, like the gallicas, the albas, or this damask, Celsiana, a wonderful old rose to grow, these bloom on stems that were produced the previous year. So if I had cut this back in April, it wouldn't have bloomed. Sooner or later, I may want to do some pruning on this because it's getting quite big and overhanging the path a little bit, but I'd wait until after these flowers are gone, probably in about mid-July. The only other thing I have to do occasionally is a little bit of training. You'll notice that I've put a split rail fence here. This is a very young rose planting, but as it gets older, we'll need to do a little training, won't we, Elliot?
Well, this one is particularly unruly, Barbara.
Yeah, Prairie Dawn, this beautiful salmony pink one, flopping over the path.
Here, let me help you tie him up.
As this gets longer, we'll train it horizontally along this fence to get more bloom. Boy, there's some pretty roses coming out here.
You sure are.
Look at this Blanc Double du Coubert. It's a lovely, old, double, fragrant hybrid rugosa.
About as nice as they come.
And this, though, I think this is my absolute favorite over here. Rosa rubrifolia. It has gorgeous blue foliage with red veins. Look at that effect, especially with the little single pink flowers that it bears. Those only bloom once this time of year, but that bush is pretty all season long.
I also think roses look pretty when people are wearing them. May I pick you a bud over here?
Sure.
How about this one?
Not that one.
Well, why not?
Well, the sepals are pointing straight up. That's those green pointy things. And that means that there's a chance it may not open after you pick it. I'd go with this one, Elliot.
Okay. There you are.
Thank you, my dear. For now, goodbye and good gardening.
Next on TLC, get started on easy home projects that anyone can handle here on Homebodies. Then indulge your creative side with Debbie Stapley on Crafts & Company here on TLC.